This book isn't about Donald Trump. It's about what they call the disturbing reality of what happened inside the Democratic Party leading up to the 2024 election. Based on interviews with nearly 200 insiders, they argue that the party engaged in a charade, a massive groupthink effort to prop up a candidate who they knew was failing, all because they were so afraid of the alternative. It's a story about the failure to see what was, as George Orwell once wrote, right in front of one's nose. On the morning after the 2024 election, in the White House, President Joe Biden is waking up convinced that he had been wronged, that if the party hadn't pushed him out of the race after that disastrous debate, he would have beaten Donald Trump. But just a few miles away, at the vice president's residence, the mood is completely different. Kamala Harris and her team are grappling with the reality of their loss, and for them, the blame lies squarely with one person. A top Harris campaign official, David Plouffe, who ran Obama's 2008 campaign, puts it bluntly. He says, "He totally fucked us." He describes the campaign as a fucking nightmare of a rescue mission, trying to make up for lost time. And this wasn't just sour grapes from a losing campaign. It was a sentiment echoed by many top Democrats. The book calls the original sin of the 2024 election President Biden's decision to run for re-election in the first place. Remember, back in 2020, he called himself a bridge to the next generation, and many top advisors said it was virtually inconceivable that he'd run again as an octogenarian. But he did. And the real issue wasn't just his age, it was his rapidly diminishing abilities. What the public saw was concerning, but what was happening in private was worse. There were increasing moments where he would freeze up, lose his train of thought, forget the names of top aides, or not recognize old friends. His team knew this, and instead of being honest about it, they tried to hide it. That now infamous debate on June 27th wasn't just a bad night, as his team claimed. It was the moment the public finally saw the reality that many insiders had been witnessing for years. The book details how dozens of top Democratic officials, donors, and pundits were privately worried about Biden's condition. But when they would call the White House, they were met with a constant refrain from top aides. He's fine, I promise he's okay." One prominent Democrat tells a story of defending Biden for months based on these assurances. But after Biden dropped out, this person finally met with the president and first lady in private. Their takeaway? He was not fine. It was not fine. "I got emotional leaving the White House because he was clearly not fucking fine." It was, as the book describes it, a mass gaslighting of the party and the American people. The election was incredibly close, decided by just over 200,000 votes across 3 states. What if Biden had decided not to run back in 2023? The party would have had a healthy, competitive primary. Candidates like Gretchen Whitmer, Gavin Newsom, and Kamala Harris would have been battle-tested. They would have had time to introduce themselves to the country, hone their message, and emerge as a stronger nominee representing change. Instead, the party was left scrambling. By clinging to power and refusing to be honest about his decline, Joe Biden, the man whose entire presidency was about stopping Donald Trump, ended up guaranteeing his return. Get up! To understand how the 2024 election unfolded, you first have to understand the personal mythology of Joe Biden. It's a story defined by a single powerful phrase his father taught him, a mantra that echoed throughout his entire life. Get up. Oh, it's like... The book chronicles a lifetime of almost unimaginable setbacks, and Biden's resilience in the face of them. He was mocked for his stutter as a child. He won an underdog Senate race only to have his world shattered a month later when his wife and baby daughter were killed in a car crash. His first presidential run in 1988 ended in a plagiarism scandal, and just months later, a brain aneurysm nearly killed him. His 2008 presidential run was another flop. And then came the most crushing blow of all, losing his son, Beau, to brain cancer in 2015. Through every single one of these tragedies, he got back up. This history of overcoming the impossible became the foundation for his belief that he could conquer any obstacle even the undeniable realities of age. It's a powerful narrative of survival that shaped not just the man, but the presidency. This personal mythology of getting up became something else entirely within his small, tight-knit inner circle. The authors of the book describe it as a kind of theology, a near-religious faith in Joe Biden's ability to rise again. And within this belief system, any skepticism, any doubt was forbidden. They had a private family, saying that captures this mindset perfectly. Never call a fat person fat. It wasn't just about being polite. It was a metaphor for a much deeper practice of ignoring inconvenient truths. As someone close to the family told the authors, the Bidens' greatest strength is living in their own reality. And the most inconvenient truth of all was the president's clear and worsening cognitive decline. The theology demanded that no one acknowledge it. The refusal to see the truth wasn't just a blind spot. It became an active effort by his closest aides to hide his deterioration. A former senior White House aide is quoted as confessing, "We attempted to shield him from his own staff. So many people didn't realize the extent of the decline." Yeah, that same aide, who says they love Joe Biden for his decency, calls the decision to let him run again a disservice to the country. It was a choice to protect the mythology, even if it meant ignoring the reality that was unfolding right in front of them, a reality that would ultimately have devastating consequences for his party and the nation. The Politburo. During the 2020 campaign, even then, there were early warning signs about Joe Biden's cognitive state that had some of his own aides deeply worried. During a grueling bus tour in Iowa, he reportedly struggled to remember the name of Mike Donnellan, an aide who had been with him since 1981. His debate performances had his own team white-knuckling their way through them. Among some campaign staff, the topic was considered almost taboo, but the whispers were there. There were two Bidens. There was the good Biden, who could still deliver a high-energy rally, but there was also an old Biden, whose performances were meandering and subdued. This protective instinct was embodied by Biden's small, intensely loyal inner circle, a group of veteran aides known internally as the Politburo. These were people like Mike Donnellan, Steve Ricchetti, and Bruce Reed, men who had been with Biden for decades. Their loyalty was almost familial, and they created an insular bubble around the candidate. Their protective instincts went as far as secretly loading a teleprompter with answers for Biden before a local interview, a practice that the campaign's press team had to step in and stop. The COVID-19 pandemic, the book argues, was one of the best things to happen to the 2020 campaign. It created a cocoon that shielded Biden from the usual grind of travel and rallies, but it also created a moment of shocking clarity for some insiders. The campaign had to produce videos for the virtual Democratic National Convention. When the raw footage came back, some on the production team were horrified. One top Democrat who saw the unedited videos as saying, "It was like a different person. This was like watching Grandpa who shouldn't be driving." Another said that after seeing the footage, they became disillusioned, realizing that the team around Biden must see this every day. It led them to a harsh conclusion. They've been gaslighting us. Despite all this, the campaign developed a digital strategy to counter the viral clips of Biden's stumbles by pushing out images of him looking stronger and more assertive. And of course, he went on to win the election. But his inner circle, the Politburo, took the wrong lesson from that narrow victory. Instead of seeing it as a close call that highlighted a major vulnerability, they saw it as a validation of their Biden theology, the belief that he could overcome any obstacle, including his age. That defiant self-confidence born from the 2020 win is what set the stage for the disastrous campaign of 2024. The Bidenness. For decades, Joe Biden has had a reputation for being a gaffe machine. He's known for being hot-tempered with staff and for telling long, rambling stories. Like in 2007 when he described his primary opponent, Barack Obama, as the first mainstream African-American who is articulate and bright and clean and a nice-looking guy. It was cringe-worthy, but it was also just Biden being Biden. This long-standing reputation became the perfect camouflage for what was happening later in his presidency. It made it incredibly difficult for people, staff, reporters, even world leaders, to tell the difference between his established personality and actual cognitive decline. One former European leader recalls a meeting with Biden that went on and on with the president rambling, but his first thought wasn't that something was wrong. It was, he's always been a bit like that, hasn't he? It was only in a later meeting, when Secretary of State Tony Blinken had to jump in to steer the conversation back on track, that the leader realized Biden was clearly not at the top of his game. The Bidenness of it all gave everyone an excuse to look the other way. So how did the people who saw him every single day not notice? White House aides used a metaphor to explain it: boiling frog syndrome. The story goes that if you put a frog in a pot of tepid water and slowly heat it up, the frog won't notice the gradual change until it's too late. The argument was that the president's deterioration was so gradual that those closest to him just got used to it. They made accommodations, helping him appear at his best, and in doing so, whether they knew it or not, they became accomplices in what the book calls a cover-up. But that whole boiling frog story, it's a myth. Scientists have actually tested it, and in real life, the frog jumps out of the pot as soon as the water gets uncomfortable. The implication is chilling. The people around the president weren't passive victims of a slow, imperceptible change. They had a choice. They felt the water getting hotter, and instead of jumping out, they made the complicated decision to stay, to ignore the unfortunate reality that was right in front of them. I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear. The story of the 2024 election didn't start in 2024. To really understand it, you have to go back to the very beginning of the Biden presidency in 2021. The president came into office with a powerful and loyal inner circle, a group of veteran aides the book calls the Politburo. And at the head of that group, as chief of staff, was Ron Klain, who immediately began steering the new administration in a more progressive direction. This created some early friction. During the high-stakes fight to pass the bipartisan infrastructure law, Speaker Nancy Pelosi brought the president to Capitol Hill twice to rally House Democrats. But both times, he delivered long, rambling speeches that left his own party confused. One Democrat called his remarks incomprehensible. He never made a clear ask, never told them exactly what he needed them to do. It was the first sign of a communication struggle that would plague his presidency, with aides left wondering, was this a deliberate strategy, or the first signs of cognitive slippage? While the White House was fighting legislative battles, two major events were shaping the public's perception of the new president. The first was the chaotic and calamitous U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan in August 2021. The fallout was devastating, and it's the moment his approval ratings sank into the 30s, a level from which they would never recover. Then, in January of 2022, the president held a press conference that went on for nearly 2 hours. He went completely off script, taking questions long after his staff tried to wrap it up. The performance was so disastrous that the First Lady reportedly burst into a room afterward and blasted the staff, asking, "Where were you guys?" As if the president himself wasn't even responsible for his own actions. This protective instinct from the First Lady is a central theme of this period. The book portrays she as a chief denier of her husband's decline and an incredibly powerful force within the administration. Her top aide, Anthony Bernal, became a key enforcer, known by some as the leader of the loyalty police, constantly ensuring that everyone around the president was a true Biden person. This protective bubble was also a response to the immense personal tragedy the family was enduring. The book directly connects the president's decline to the grief from his son Beau's death, compounded by the addiction struggles of his other children, Hunter and Ashley. Hunter's tell-all memoir, Beautiful Things, published in 2021, created a new crisis, revealing shocking details that his father had never known and giving federal prosecutors new evidence to work with. This combination of political pressure and personal turmoil led the White House to create a fortress of concealment around the president. Access to him became severely restricted, even for his own cabinet members and the resident staff who look after the family's living quarters. But the most telling act of concealment came in November 2021. The White House released the results of the president's annual physical. The report was notable for what it was missing: any mention of a cognitive exam. For a 78-year-old man, this was a glaring omission, especially since Democrats had loudly demanded that President Trump take one. The only reason to skip a cognitive test while performing a neurological one was if you were afraid of the results. It was the final piece of the puzzle, solidifying a narrative of a White House that, from its first year, was actively working to hide the president's true condition from the American people. The most privileged nursing home in the country. It was part of a long, bipartisan tradition in Washington, covering for aging politicians whose health is failing. The book uses Nikki Haley's famous line to frame the issue, calling the Senate the most privileged nursing home in the country. Like Congresswoman Kay Granger, who was reportedly placed in a facility for dementia patients, while her office continued to collect her congressional paycheck. And of course, there were the very public moments when Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell seemed to freeze up mid-sentence. In Washington, there's a complicit silence around these issues. And this is nothing new. This practice has been going on for decades, particularly in the Senate, where power is based on seniority. The most notorious example was probably Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina. He served until he was 100 years old. Towards the end of his career in the 1990s, his cognitive decline was an open secret. He was once heard referring to the Mexicans who attacked the Alamo as Russians. Yet he remained third in line to the presidency, Senator Dianne Feinstein of California. In 2020, at a public hearing, she asked the CEO of Twitter the exact same question twice in a row. It was clear to many in Washington that she was struggling, but she remained in office. This happens because staffers, lobbyists, and family members all have a vested interest in keeping these powerful figures in place, even when they are no longer fit to serve. This history of deception isn't limited to Congress. It extends all the way to the White House. After Woodrow Wilson had a debilitating stroke, his wife and doctor basically ran the country for over a year, concealing the true extent of his condition from his own cabinet. John F. Kennedy flat out lied to a reporter, denying that he had Addison's disease, and to this day, there are still questions about when exactly Ronald Reagan's Alzheimer's began. While the act of concealing a president's health may not be new, the specific circumstances and the ultimate outcome of the 2024 election made this particular cover-up arguably the most consequential in modern American history. Who else is going to do this? By 2022, the second year of the Biden presidency, the White House was quietly making more and more accommodations for an aging commander-in-chief. Outwardly, the president was leading the Western world's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But behind the scenes, his tendency to go off script was causing headaches. On a trip to Poland, he ad-libbed a line about Vladimir Putin, saying, "For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power," any comment his staff had to immediately walk back. A few months later in Tokyo, he broke with decades of U.S. policy by stating flatly that yes, the U.S. would get involved militarily to defend Taiwan. His aides scrambled to explain it away as just Biden being Biden. But the accommodations were becoming harder to ignore. His public events were drying up. By mid-2022, he had held fewer than half the number of press conferences as his recent predecessors. As one senior official admitted, the president had lost a step. Inside the White House, the staff was adapting. The speechwriting team noticed the president was flubbing lines more often and struggling with complex ideas. So everything got shorter: speeches, paragraphs, even sentences. The vocabulary shrank. They began grafting his old familiar catchphrases onto new speeches, because those were the lines he could deliver most easily. The reliance on scripts became pervasive. Cabinet meetings were described by one secretary as terrible and so scripted that there was no room for real dialogue. The president was becoming increasingly dependent on teleprompters and note cards. even in private meetings with his own top officials. By 2022, some cabinet members were already privately expressing bewilderment at the idea that he could run for a second term. While the inner circle was making adjustments, some allies on the outside were growing deeply concerned. David Axelrod, President Obama's former chief strategist, had been worried for years. He recalls being stunned by how much Biden had aged when he met with him in 2018. By June of 2022, Axelrod decided he had to speak up, telling the New York Times that Biden's age would be a major issue if he ran again. The warning was not well received. He got an angry phone call from the White House Chief of Staff, Ron Klain. "Who else is going to do this, Ax?" Klain demanded. "Who's going to beat Trump? President Biden is the only one who has done it." The message was clear. The inner circle was closing ranks, and any dissent would be treated as a betrayal. The final nail in the coffin for any internal debate came with the 2022 midterm elections. The much-predicted red wave never materialized. Democrats held their own, and the Biden team took it as a personal vindication. They believed it was proof that the president still had a special relationship with the everyday people that elites just didn't get. This interpretation was a dangerous misreading. It ignored the fact that many Democratic candidates had run away from the president on the campaign trail, and that the results were driven more by a backlash to the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision than by any love for the incumbent. But with that victory in hand, the decision was made. There was no formal process. No real discussion of the risks. It was simply presented as a done deal. And the rationale was twofold. First, there was the Kamala excuse, the widespread belief within the Biden inner circle that the vice president simply couldn't win an election on her own. And second, there was the family's fear of what Donald Trump might do to them if he returned to power. With those two factors as the driving force, the decision was locked in, and the party began its slow march toward the disaster of 2024. Dr. Biden. As the questions about President Biden's age grew louder, a powerful and protective force was working behind the scenes to keep the re-election campaign on track. The First Lady, Dr. Jill Biden. A tense dinner in Boston in the summer of 2022. A major Democratic donor, a co-chairman of Bain Capital, delicately raises the issue. He says he doesn't want an 86-year-old doctor operating on him, an 86-year-old pilot flying his plane, or an 86-year-old president running the country. It's a direct but respectful challenge. Before Dr. Biden can even respond, her top aide, Anthony Bernal, jumps in to deflect. Later that night, the First Lady was reportedly furious with herself, not for the confrontation, but because, in her own words, "I can't believe I didn't defend Joe." This as a pivotal moment when her resolve hardened. She would not let that happen again. Dr. Biden was one of the chief supporters of the re-election campaign and a chief denier of the president's deterioration. She wielded immense power, sitting in on job interviews, and through her top aide influencing the West Wing, and that aide, Anthony Bernal, as a central character in this drama. He was more than just a staffer. He was her closest confidant, a strategist, and a fierce enforcer. The book says he would refer to himself as the Biden marriage counselor and was known by some colleagues as the leader of the loyalty police, constantly questioning aides to see if they were true Biden people. He had incredible control over the president's schedule and could end a debate or push a decision forward with a simple, powerful threat. Jill isn't going to like this. He was so abrasive that senior White House aides reportedly had to remind their staff about the official channels for reporting unprofessional conduct. Together, Dr. Biden and Bernal created a powerful, protective bubble around the president. And long before the re-election campaign was official, Dr. Biden was signaling that it was a done deal at a state dinner for French President Emmanuel Macron in late 2022. The First Lady was overheard telling President Macron that she was getting in shape because campaigns are so tough. Speaker Pelosi's daughter, who was at the table, was reportedly shocked. What campaign? Everyone thought the "I'm a bridge" presidency was a settled issue, but that moment made it clear to those in the room. The decision had already been made. The plan was to run again, and Dr. Jill Biden was already preparing for the fight. Are we sure this is a good idea? So what was happening inside the Biden White House in 2023? The year kicked off with a major change at the top. Longtime Chief of Staff Ron Klain, who was known for his relentless work ethic, was heading for the exit. He was worn out, and after a health scare in his office, it was clear he needed a break. The person tapped to replace him was Jeff Zients, the former COVID czar. The choice wasn't a simple one. Some insiders felt another top aide, Steve Ricchetti, was too close to Biden to deliver hard truths. Klain, on the other hand, saw Zients as an implementer, someone who could keep the trains running on time. But even as Zients stepped in, a question was already hanging in the air, whispered in private by senior aides like Anita Dunn. Are we sure this is a good idea? She wasn't questioning Biden's mind, but she was worried about his ability to withstand the rigors of a campaign. She didn't want to see him embarrassed. These concerns were happening just as the president's doctor released a medical summary. It mentioned his gait was still stiff, but it also noted that, once again, no cognitive test had been done. Now, while this was going on behind the scenes, the image the White House projected was one of pure strength. In early 2023, Biden took an incredibly risky and grueling trip to Kyiv to show solidarity with Ukraine. It was a 10-hour overnight train ride into a war zone, a place where the U.S. had no control over the airspace. The Secret Service was against it, but Biden was determined. The world saw these powerful images of him standing shoulder to shoulder with President Zelensky as air raid sirens blared. It was a defining moment that projected stamina and grit. His team, and even the First Lady, pointed to it as proof that he was more than up to the job. But just 2 months later, a very different picture emerged. During a 4-day trip to Ireland, some congressmen traveling with him saw a different side of the president. After a day of events, they saw Hunter Biden telling his father, "You promised you wouldn't do this. You know you can't handle all this." One congressman, Mike Quigley, was struck by how familiar it all felt. He said the president reminded him of his own father before he passed away from Parkinson's. Moments of energy in front of a crowd, followed by a complete crash, appearing deflated and drained. It was a stark contrast to the hero of Kyiv, and it got these officials quietly questioning if the president was in cognitive decline. As 2023 went on, it became clear the White House was building a bubble around the president. An analysis of his schedule showed that most of his public events were happening in a tight window on weekdays, roughly between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. Even his own aides admitted they were trying to organize the day around his limited energy. The accommodations became more and more apparent. Filming simple video messages turned into a major production. They started using 2 cameras so they could make a jump cut if he flubbed a line, which was happening more often. One person involved in the shoots said flatly, "The man could not speak." Sometimes the footage was so rough it was just unusable. The campaign also went on the offensive against any journalist who dared to report on this. When Axios and later the New York Times wrote stories about his limited schedule and age, the response from the White House and campaign was swift and aggressive. They enlisted allies to attack the reporters, shame them on social media, and paint their reporting as biased. One Democratic operative explained, "It was a full-blown freakout whenever these stories dropped." The goal was simple: make the topic of the president's health and age completely toxic for the media to touch. Then came the story that would blow the whole issue wide open: the special counsel investigation led by Robert Hur. This all started when Biden's lawyers found classified documents at his post-vice presidency office. This discovery led Hur to a ghostwriter who had helped Biden with his memoirs, and that ghostwriter had tapes. On one of these tapes, recorded in 2017, Biden is heard saying, "I just found all the classified stuff downstairs." This was a bombshell. It showed he knew he had these documents, and when he was a private citizen. But the tapes revealed something else. Even back in 2017, Biden sounded very old and quite diminished. He struggled to remember things and often lost his train of thought. This all came to a head when Hur's team interviewed the president in October 2023. Over 5 hours, Biden's memory failed him on critical, personal details. He couldn't recall what year his son Beau had died. He asked, "What month did Beau die?" "Oh God, May 30th. When an aide supplied the year 2015, Biden asked, "Was it 2015 he had died?" He also couldn't remember key dates from his own vice presidency. His answers would wander off into long, rambling stories that had nothing to do with the questions. The transcript is just stunning. It painted a portrait of a man whose memory had, as Hur would later write in his report, significant limitations. It led Hur's team to a crucial conclusion. They likely couldn't get a conviction because a jury would probably see him as a sympathetic, well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory. By the end of 2023, the quiet panic among insiders had become a full-blown five-alarm fire. High-dollar donors were leaving fundraisers shaken by Biden's meandering remarks and stilted conversations. David Morehouse, the former CEO of the Pittsburgh Penguins, shook the president's hand at one event and was stunned by how frail he felt. "It was nothing but bones," he later recalled. He immediately called political allies and told them, "This guy cannot run for president." Another major inflection point was Hunter Biden's failed plea deal. Those close to the family said the stress of his son potentially facing prison time caused the president to suddenly and steeply decline. The year ended with a series of unsettling scenes at White House Christmas parties. At one, guests were alarmed when the First Lady had to take the lead on delivering remarks because the president seemed unable to go off script. At another, he spoke into a microphone, but his voice was so weak he could barely be understood. Congressman Adam Smith, who hadn't seen Biden up close in over a year, was stunned. Interacting with guests, Biden seemed, in his words, completely out of it. The whispers had turned into a roar, but publicly, the party remained silent, locked in behind a candidate that many of them, in private, feared could not finish the race: Dean Phillips. So, as all this concern about President Biden's age and fitness was swirling behind the scenes in 2023, one person decided he couldn't stay quiet any longer. A Democratic congressman from Minnesota named Dean Phillips. Phillips was watching what everyone else was watching, the president's visible decline in speaking and walking, and he came to a conclusion that most of his colleagues were desperately trying to avoid. He believed it pointed to cognitive issues, but when he'd bring it up with other Democrats, he ran into a wall of what he called deep denial. They'd give him the yes, but argument. As in, yes, Biden is in decline, but can you imagine Trump winning? Phillips could absolutely imagine Trump winning, especially with Biden at the top of the ticket. He felt like he had to do something. His first move wasn't to run himself, but to try and recruit someone else. He started making calls, reaching out to prominent Democratic governors like J.B. Pritzker of Illinois and Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan. But they wouldn't even take his call. The message was clear. No one wanted to be the one to challenge the sitting president. With no one else willing to step up, Phillips decided he had to consider it himself. He started going on national television, on shows like Face the Nation and Meet the Press, and publicly called for a competitive Democratic primary. He said that Joe Biden was a wonderful and remarkable man, but that it was time for him to pass the torch. And this did not go over well. The White House Chief of Staff, Jeff Zients, called him and told him what he was doing was insane. Phillips asked to speak to the president directly, but Zients told him that wasn't going to happen. The pressure mounted inside the party, too. At a meeting of House Democrats, another congresswoman basically called him out, asking how a member of their leadership team could have a view so incongruent with the rest of us. Shortly after that, Phillips resigned from his leadership post. He was now officially an outsider. Huddled around his dining room table with a small team of advisors, he sketched out a long-shot campaign. The plan was to make a stand in the New Hampshire primary, a state famous for boosting insurgent candidates. On October 27, 2023, just before the filing deadline, he made it official and announced he was running for president. Phillips was about to get a masterclass in how the party machinery protects its own. He later said that he never understood the complaints from outsiders like Bernie Sanders or Marianne Williamson about the process being rigged. Now, he was seeing it firsthand. The Democratic National Committee, or DNC, had made its position clear early on. When committee members asked the White House if they should prepare for a primary, which would mean debates and a formal process, they were shut down. The message from the White House was simple. Biden is running. End of conversation. From there, the establishment started putting up roadblocks. First, the White House unilaterally decided to change the primary calendar. They moved South Carolina, a state Biden had won decisively in 2020, to be the very first contest. The public reason was to empower Black voters. But internally, aides admitted the real motivation was to protect Biden from a potential embarrassment in a state like New Hampshire. Next, the DNC announced there would be no officially sanctioned primary debates. This was Phillips's worst nightmare. His whole strategy was based on the idea that if he could just get on a stage with Biden, voters would see for themselves that the president wasn't up for the job. Without a debate, he couldn't prove his point. The roadblocks kept coming. In Wisconsin, the state Democratic Party refused to even put his name on the ballot, forcing him to sue all the way to the state Supreme Court, which he ultimately won. In the end, the machine was just too powerful. Phillips's campaign never gained traction. He was a voice in the wilderness, trying to force a conversation that the party was determined to avoid. After a string of losses on Super Tuesday, he suspended his campaign. He endorsed Joe Biden, but his final assessment was grim. He had failed in his mission to get the president on a debate stage, and he was left watching his party, in his own words, sleepwalk toward disaster. 2024. As the calendar flipped to the election year of 2024, there were two completely different realities inside the Biden White House. In one reality, you had the president's tight inner circle, the Politburo. They were feeling good. They saw legislative wins. They outnegotiated Republicans, and they argued that the lack of a serious primary challenger from a big-name Democrat proved Biden was strong. As one top aide, Mike Donnellan, would say, weak presidents get challenged. Biden wasn't challenged, therefore, Biden was not weak. But then there was the other reality. This was the reality for a growing number of other White House staffers, Democratic senators, and even cabinet secretaries. They were worried. In private meetings, some senators noticed a marked decline in the president's ability to speak and move. Cabinet members found their access to the president suddenly cut off. One said that from late 2023 on, the cabinet was kept at bay, and that there was clearly a deliberate strategy by the White House to have him meet with as few people as necessary. This private alarm was fueled by some truly unsettling encounters. In January 2024, there was a crucial meeting about aid to Ukraine with top congressional leaders from both parties. The official White House summary painted a picture of a president being clear and forceful. But according to Democrats who were actually in the room, it was a disaster and a shit show. They said for the first 20 minutes, the president listlessly read from a binder, was difficult to hear, stumbled over words, and trailed off. When it came time for questions, he mostly deferred to his aides. Just a week later, it happened again. During a task force meeting on reproductive rights, a senior administration official was shaken by what they saw. The president's presentation was weak and slurry. He confused his own cabinet secretaries. He mixed up Texas and Alabama. The official left the meeting and called a White House colleague the next day, saying, "I don't get how this guy can do any campaigning." They later said, "Even though he did so many good things for this country, I can never forgive him for not stepping aside." Then, in February, the story that had been simmering behind the scenes completely boiled over. Special counsel Robert Hur released his report on Biden's handling of classified documents. The conclusion was a political earthquake. Hur stated that Biden had willfully retained and disclosed classified materials, but he said no criminal charges were warranted. Hur concluded that a jury would likely see the president as a sympathetic, well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory. The report described how, during his interview, Biden's memory was worse than it had been in 2017. He couldn't remember, even within several years, when his son Beau had died. He struggled to recall when his own vice presidency began and ended. The White House response was to declare war, not on the findings about the documents, but on the description of the president's memory. They called the report gratuitous and politically motivated. Vice President Harris attacked the prosecutor's integrity. Then came the leaks to the press, with sources close to the president saying that Attorney General Merrick Garland should have edited the report and would likely not serve in a second term. The whole thing came to a head in a hastily arranged press conference. An angry President Biden came out and blasted the special counsel, saying, "How in the hell dare he raise that?" referring to his son's death. But in that same press conference, while trying to make a point about the crisis in Gaza, he made another stunning error, referring to Abdel Fattah el-Sisi as the president of Mexico, not Egypt. The moment seemed to confirm the very concerns the report had raised. In the wake of the Hur report, the White House went into a full public relations counteroffensive. The president's final medical exam before the election was released, and once again it declared him fit to successfully execute the duties of the presidency. But it also revealed that his team had decided against him taking a cognitive test, fearing what it might reveal. Then came the State of the Union address in March. After days of intense prep at Camp David, Biden delivered a fiery, energetic speech that temporarily silenced his critics. One Democratic congressman shouted, "Nobody's going to talk about cognitive impairment now." But behind the scenes, the relief was short-lived. Aides saw an immediate return of old Biden, who gave a rambling speech to staff right after. In a meeting with students just after the address, he was again soft, breathy, and confusing, reminding one congressman of his ailing father. Meanwhile, the campaign's own pollsters were sounding the alarm. In focus groups and polls, voters' number one concern about Biden was his age and mental fitness. But their data and warnings were largely being ignored by the campaign's top leadership. All of this, the Hur report, the private lapses, the bad polling, led to a high-stakes gamble. The president's top advisors, who had been divided on the issue, were now forced to confront a new reality. They had to put the age issue to rest, and they decided there was only one way to do it. They pushed for an unprecedentedly early presidential debate. In June, it was a massive risk. Even top aides admitted that the president's condition was getting worse, not better. The decision was made. The country would get to see for itself, and the campaign was betting everything that their candidate could rise to the occasion. D-Day. In early June of 2024, just as the presidential race was heating up, the Biden White House went to war. Not with a political opponent, but with a newspaper. On June 4th, the Wall Street Journal published a bombshell investigation with the headline, "Behind Closed Doors, Biden Shows Signs of Slipping." Citing more than 45 sources, including Democrats, the story painted a stark picture of the president in private meetings. It reported that he would read from notes to make obvious points, pause for such long periods that people wondered if he'd tuned out, and sometimes close his eyes for extended stretches. The White House reaction was immediate and ferocious. Communications Director Ben Labolt went on the attack, suggesting with no evidence that the story was a political hit job ordered by Rupert Murdoch to help Trump. The White House press office, led by Deputy Press Secretary Andrew Bates, aggressively denied the reporting. This strategy was brutally effective. Another reporter from a different national news outlet had been hearing similar stories from White House aides, but when that reporter approached the press office, they were met with such angry denials and even an off-the-record call from senior advisor Steve Ricchetti that the message was clear. Publish this and we will portray you as a liar. That reporter chose not to publish her story. Just as this battle with the press was raging, the president traveled to France for the 80th anniversary of D-Day, and the concerns that the journal had reported on were suddenly on full display for a global audience. The scene in Normandy was deeply patriotic, with surviving World War II veterans, some nearly 100 years old, being honored. But when President Biden appeared, one Democratic congressman who was there was shocked. He observed that Biden looked frailer and was shuffling more than many of the World War II veterans. Another congressman, a Marine veteran named Seth Moulton, said he felt embarrassed as an American, watching the enfeebled U.S. president next to the energetic French leader, Emmanuel Macron. Moulton's heart sank when Biden made eye contact with him, but clearly had no idea who he was. And it wasn't just the Americans who noticed. President Macron was overheard saying he was gêné, the French word for embarrassed, on Biden's behalf. An aide to another European leader confirmed this wasn't new, saying that in longer, unscripted conversations that required a thought process, it was hard for Biden. The verdict. Just weeks before the first presidential debate, President Biden was hit by two intensely stressful events, moments that those close to him would later point to as catalysts for his accelerating decline. The first was the trial of his son, Hunter. For a week in June, the entire Biden family sat front and center in a Wilmington courthouse as their most painful family secrets were laid bare. The president's own Justice Department put his daughter-in-law on the stand to testify against his son. Biden was consumed by guilt, believing the trial never would have happened if he hadn't run for president. He even repeatedly offered to testify himself, a move that would have been almost without precedent. The trial ended with a swift guilty verdict on all 3 felony counts, a devastating blow to a father who, aides felt, had become his son's chief enabler. Just days after that verdict, the president flew to Los Angeles for what was supposed to be a triumphant, record-breaking fundraiser. Hollywood mogul Jeffrey Katzenberg had pulled out all the stops, getting George Clooney and Julia Roberts to host, and Jimmy Kimmel to moderate a conversation with Biden and former President Barack Obama. The event would raise over $30 million. But backstage, a private drama unfolded that left the hosts and top donors horrified. When President Biden arrived, he appeared, in the words of one attendee, severely diminished, hobbling, and like someone who was not alive. George Clooney, who had known Biden for nearly 20 years, felt a knot in his stomach. When the president approached him, it was obvious he had no idea who Clooney was. An aide had to gently remind the president of the United States that he was speaking to George Clooney. Even Barack Obama seemed concerned, at times stepping in to finish sentences for his former running mate during photo ops. The alarm only grew when the main event started. On stage, Biden's answers were described as quiet, frail, and downright confusing. After the conversation wrapped up, President Obama and Jimmy Kimmel started to walk off stage, but Biden just stood there, appearing to freeze as he stared blankly into the crowd. After a few awkward seconds, Obama walked back, took Biden by the arm, and gently guided him off stage. The moment, which was captured on video, sent a wave of panic through the Democrats in the audience. Congresswoman Annie Kuster, sitting in the crowd, turned to a colleague and said, "We can't go out there and campaign for 4 more years. That's just not tenable." The book even reports that Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer had been privately telling people that if the upcoming debate went south, the party's top leaders had a plan B. All of this set the stage for a frantic final push to prepare for the debate. The stakes were astronomical. But just days before prep was set to begin, another incoherent moment at a White House immigration event added to the anxiety. When the team finally got to Camp David, they found a president who was, according to Ron Klain, rusty, exhausted, and sleeping for large parts of the day. His performance in the mock debates ranged from bad to passable. To make matters worse, he came down with a severe cold that left his voice raspy and weak, to the point that aides couldn't even hear him during the practice sessions. Still, despite all the warning signs, the team left Camp David clinging to a desperate hope. As one of them put it, "Okay, well, our guy is a game day performer." The debate. The night of the first presidential debate, June 27th, 2024, the tension at CNN's Atlanta studio was thick, and there was a problem. One of the candidates was late. Donald Trump had arrived hours earlier, touring the stage, peppering the crew with questions like a seasoned TV pro. But with the clock ticking toward the 9 p.m. start time, President Biden was nowhere to be seen. A CNN executive finally called his top aide, Anita Dunn, who explained that the president just didn't feel like he needed a walkthrough. He finally arrived and stepped onto the stage just 10 minutes before going live. When the debate started, the visual contrast was immediate. Biden walked to his lectern with a noticeably stiffer gait. His voice, when he first spoke, was raspy and thin. And for the first few minutes, things were okay. A little shaky, a little phlegmy, but nothing catastrophic. Then, about 11 minutes in, the wheels came completely off. Asked about the national debt, Biden started strong, but then began to wobble. He tried to list his administration's priorities, and the words just wouldn't come. The transcript shows him struggling, Frauen Naufkins, making sure that we're able to make every single solitary person eligible for what I've been able to do with the COVID, with dealing with everything we have to do with. He then uttered a phrase that would define the night. We finally beat Medicare. In the control room, moderator Dana Bash scribbled a note and passed it to her co-moderator Jake Tapper. It said, "He just lost the election." It got worse. When the topic turned to abortion, what should have been a huge advantage for Biden, he again lost the thread. He meandered into a bizarre and tragic tangent about the border crisis, and then made the jaw-dropping claim that young women were being raped by their sisters. A few minutes later, after another moment of rambling incoherence, Trump delivered a brutal and accurate blow. I really don't know what he said at the end of that sentence. I don't think he knows what he said either. All of this happened in the first 22 minutes. In the campaign war rooms, the reaction was instant. On a Zoom call with top Biden aides, campaign chair Jen O'Malley Dillon stated the obvious. Look, this isn't going well. Ron Klain, who had prepped the president, knew it was a disaster. The Trump team was just as shocked, but for a different reason. They had been attacking Biden's fitness for months, but they never thought it would be this bad. Campaign manager Chris LaCivita turned to his colleagues and said, "Oh, fuck, he's not going to last. Let's die. There's just no way." He was convinced Biden wouldn't even make it to the November election. While those early moments were the most shocking, the rest of the debate was a sustained failure. Biden was unable to effectively prosecute the case against Trump, garbling attacks on everything from NATO to January 6th. He even struggled to clearly explain his own signature accomplishments, like lowering prescription drug prices. Visually, he often appeared disengaged, staring at the floor with his mouth agape, looking significantly older and more frail than his opponent. When the 90 minutes were finally over, President Biden seemed completely unaware of the catastrophe that had just unfolded. He approached the moderators and made small talk, remarking only on his voice, saying, "Sorry about my voice, I have a cold." But for many Democrats watching, the performance raised a terrifying existential question. As one senior Democrat who had worked on the campaign wondered that night, just who the hell is running the country? Stalwan. The world reacts. On MSNBC, the president's former press secretary, Jen Psaki, was supposed to be hosting a live stream. Minutes in, she was speechless. A staffer asked if they should just turn it off. Psaki nodded. "This is a fucking disaster," she said. It wasn't just politics. She was worried that the president was seriously ill. On the air, the consensus among the network's hosts was one of sheer panic. David Plouffe, Obama's former campaign manager, called it a DEFCON 1 moment, noting that the two candidates were 3 years apart in age, but on that stage they seemed about 30 years apart. The panic was even worse among the party's biggest donors. In Los Angeles, a star-studded watch party was being held at the home of a former ambassador. 3 Democratic governors were there. The second gentleman, Doug Emhoff, was there. And just a few minutes into the debate, the legendary director, Rob Reiner, stood up and stated plainly, "We are fucked." He was furious. He looked straight at the vice president's husband and yelled, "We're going to lose our fucking democracy because of you." At another donor event in Atlanta, the finance chair of the Biden Victory Fund was overheard saying, "This is over. It's all over." The phones of campaign leadership began blowing up with texts from donors threatening to pull their money unless Biden dropped out. The party's elected leaders were in the same state of shock. In Washington, D.C., about 50 House Democrats were gathered for a watch party. One of them turned to the caucus chair, Pete Aguilar, and said, "I just lost my job." After the debate, they surrounded their leader, Hakeem Jeffries, demanding that something has to be done. Meanwhile, Vice President Kamala Harris, who was booked for 4 post-debate interviews, was scrambling with her team to figure out what to say. They eventually landed on a talking point. A slow start, but a strong finish. But when CNN's Anderson Cooper pressed her on how different Biden seemed from just a few years ago, the vice president grew angry, later telling colleagues, "This motherfucker doesn't treat me like the damn vice president of the United States." While the rest of the party was melting down, the president's inner circle was a bizarre island of calm and defiance. Top aide Mike Donilon told panicked callers he had a bad debate and insisted they could fight through it. But this message didn't reach the lower-level campaign staff. In the campaign war room, people were horrified. One person dramatically laid down on the floor in despair. Many felt foolish and betrayed by their own bosses, who had insisted for months that the president was fine. The disconnect was on full display at a post-debate rally. The First Lady took the stage and offered what the book calls infantile praise, saying, "Joe, you did such a great job. You answered every question. You knew all the facts." The president then took the mic and told a rambling, completely fabricated story about John Wayne calling someone a lying, dog-faced pony soldier. It was a moment that perfectly captured the campaign's denial. They were also pushing a misleading line about their focus group, Dials, claiming that voters disliked Trump while conveniently leaving out the part where those same voters' confidence in Biden's ability to be president had been completely shattered. For those who had been sounding the alarm for months, the night was a grim vindication. Friends of special counsel Robert Hur, who had been vilified for describing the president's poor memory in his report, texted him messages like, "Vindication." Hur, for his part, told them he just felt sad for the president. Longtime critics like David Axelrod and Bill Daley were furious. They were angry at the president, his family, and his team for letting it get to this point. They did such a disservice to Joe Biden and to the country, Axelrod would later say. They saw a party that had refused to confront a reality that was now exploding in their faces on the biggest stage imaginable. The bad times. In the immediate aftermath, the president's inner circle went into a state of denial. They acted like the debate hadn't really happened, dismissing it as just a bad night. This left lower-level aides feeling gaslit by their own bosses. The very next day, at a rally in North Carolina, a defiant President Biden addressed the disaster head-on. Reading from a teleprompter, he admitted, "I don't walk as easy as I used to. I don't speak as smoothly as I used to. I don't debate as well as I used to." But he insisted, "I know how to do this job." While he was projecting confidence, the rest of the Democratic world was in a full-blown panic. Powerful figures like Ari Emanuel were publicly furious, and even former President Obama had to issue a cautious tweet, trying to downplay the meltdown. The initial shock quickly turned into a tidal wave of pressure. The New York Times published a stunning editorial titled, "To Serve His Country, President Biden Should Leave the Race." Then came the first public defection from a fellow Democrat. Congressman Lloyd Doggett of Texas issued a statement calling on the president to withdraw, just as LBJ had done under different circumstances. The dominoes began to fall. Hollywood, a key source of Democratic money, turned on him. Mega donors like George Clooney published op-eds, and producer Damon Lindelof even called for a dembargo, a complete halt to all fundraising until Biden was off the ticket. Behind the scenes, Senate Democrats, led by Chuck Schumer and Mark Warner, began organizing to figure out how to confront the president. This led to a series of incredibly tense, high-stakes showdowns. First, Biden met with the nation's Democratic governors. He walked into the room and immediately declared, "I'm not going anywhere." But the governors pushed back. Ned Lamont of Connecticut asked why not just step aside, while Maura Healey of Massachusetts told him bluntly, "You do not need to do this." Next came 2 disastrous Zoom calls with members of Congress, on calls with both the Progressive Caucus and the more moderate New Democrat coalition. Biden was angry and defensive, rejecting their polling data and lashing out at a congressman who questioned his national security record. The confrontations culminated in 2 private meetings with the party's most powerful legislative leaders. Nancy Pelosi met with the president and questioned the rosy polling his team was showing him. But the final, most dramatic meeting was with Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. He drove to Biden's home in Delaware, sat down with him, and delivered the bluntest assessment possible. He told the president that if there were a secret ballot in the Senate, he'd only get 5 votes. He told him that his own campaign pollsters believed he had only a 5% chance of winning. "If I were you," Schumer said, "I wouldn't run." The pressure was now unbearable. The campaign's own pollsters finally briefed the senior staff, confirming the grim reality. The age issue was a settled question, and they were trailing in every battleground state. The president's top aides, Mike Donnellan and Steve Ricchetti, finally conceded to him that the only path forward was a brutal, scorched earth campaign that would tear the Democratic Party apart. Faced with this and a diagnosis of COVID that left him feeling awful, Biden finally relented. On Sunday, July 21st, he called Vice President Kamala Harris and told her he was dropping out. He then posted the announcement on social media, sending a seismic shock through the political world. Within hours, after a rapid-fire series of phone calls, Kamala Harris had consolidated the support of nearly every major figure in the Democratic Party. The shortest, most chaotic primary in modern history was over. Joy. The moment Joe Biden dropped out of the race, the clock started on one of the most audacious gambles in modern political history. A 107-day sprint to elect Kamala Harris. To help run this unprecedented campaign, her team called in one of the biggest names in Democratic politics, David Plouffe, the architect of Barack Obama's 2008 victory. When Plouffe and the new team got their first look at the Biden campaign's internal polling, they saw just how dire the situation was. The data was, in a word, gruesome. It showed that President Biden wasn't just losing, he was on track for a historic electoral bloodbath. He was trailing in all the key battlegrounds and was in serious danger of losing states that should have been safe, like Minnesota, Virginia, and even New Hampshire. The party had pulled back from the brink of a disaster of epic proportions. The new campaign faced an impossible challenge. While Harris got an initial bump in the polls, bringing the race to within striking distance, she was still tied to an unpopular administration during a time of deep voter dissatisfaction. Her new team, including Plouffe, knew they had to create some distance and show voters that she was something new, not just more of the same. But this created the central conflict of her campaign. How could she chart her own course without looking disloyal to the man who had just handed her the nomination? Her team pushed her to outline how her presidency would differ from Biden's on key issues like the economy or the border, but Harris resisted. She feared the political fallout, especially as a black woman vice president being seen as turning on a white man president. The risk of being labeled a backstabber was too high. This reluctance to create distance led to some key missteps that reinforced the very narrative her campaign was trying to escape. The most damaging moment came during an interview on The View, when co-host Sunny Hostin asked what she would have done differently than President Biden over the past 4 years. Harris gave an answer that would haunt her campaign. "There is not a thing that comes to mind." The clip was immediately seized by the Trump campaign and used in attack ads. In another interview, when pressed on why she had so staunchly defended Biden's fitness after the debate, she refused to admit she had been anything less than truthful, falling back on the line that it was just a bad debate. But if that's all it was, the obvious question was why she was now the nominee. It undermined her credibility and made it harder to present herself as a change agent. Even off the campaign trail, Joe Biden remained an albatross around her neck. He continued to create unhelpful and unnecessary distractions. At one event, he playfully put on a Trump 2024 hat, creating a viral image that forced the Harris campaign to make a painful decision. They could no longer do joint public appearances with him. The worst gaffe came in the final week of the election. Right before Harris was set to deliver a major speech on national unity, Biden was on a get out the vote call and referred to Trump's supporters as garbage. The comment completely hijacked the news cycle, saved the Trump campaign from its own spiraling controversy, and stepped all over the message his own party's nominee was trying to deliver. For the Harris campaign, it was a final, painful reminder that they were running not just against Donald Trump, but against the ghost of the administration they could never fully escape. Out the door, the final months of the Biden presidency were marked by a sense of bitterness and resentment. At a farewell party for senior aide Anita Dunn, she quoted lines about revenge and enemies from The Godfather, which struck some in attendance as a revealing look into the bunker mentality of the president's inner circle. The president himself seemed resentful, lashing out at reporters who asked about his age, at one point yelling, "I know more world leaders than any one of you ever met in your whole goddamn life." But the most controversial and defining act of his final days was the pardons. Despite years of promising an independent Justice Department, President Biden issued a full and unconditional pardon to his son, Hunter. It covered not only his recent tax and gun convictions, but also any potential crime he might have committed over an 11-year period. The public explanation for the pardon echoed Donald Trump's own claims of a politically motivated prosecution, with Biden stating that raw politics has infected this process. This infuriated Attorney General Merrick Garland and Special Counsel David Weiss, who said the president's accusations were gratuitous and wrong. Many of Biden's own aides were angry, feeling he had undermined the very norms he had pledged to restore. To make matters worse, just before leaving office, Biden also issued preemptive pardons for his two brothers and his sister, again citing fears that Trump would weaponize the Justice Department against them. As the end of his term approached, the president's physical decline became impossible to hide. On his final foreign trips to Brazil and Angola, his shuffle was pronounced, and aides no longer seemed concerned with trying to obscure his frailties. This led to a furious round of blame casting among Democrats. Aides and allies expressed disbelief that they had ever thought he could serve another 4 years. Some blamed a kind of Stockholm syndrome for their collective denial. Others pointed fingers directly at the president's inner circle and even questioned how the First Lady couldn't see the extent of her husband's decline. To the very end, the president's closest advisors seemed determined to rewrite the history of the failed campaign. In one of his final interviews, Biden claimed that he could have won, a statement that infuriated the Harris campaign and forced him to issue a public apology. With the Biden post-presidency beginning, his inner circle having shrunk to just a last handful of believers, and his presidential library already facing trouble raising money. So after all of this, the panic, the pressure, the withdrawal, what are we left with? What happened with President Biden wasn't Watergate, but it was its own kind of scandal. A scandal about the corrupt influence of great power and how a circle of people whose entire status depends on pleasing one person can lose their way. Our system has a tool for this kind of situation, the 25th Amendment, which allows a vice president and the cabinet to remove a president who is unable to do their job. But it requires an incredible amount of political courage. And the reality of the Biden presidency was complicated. Even his critics admitted that while he had moments of incoherence and confusion, he could also have moments of clarity and make sound decisions. It wasn't a clear-cut case, which created a gray area that his team used to justify keeping him in the race. That gray area is exactly what worried medical professionals who were watching from the outside. Dr. Jonathan Reiner, a cardiologist who has consulted for the White House, states plainly that it's apparent that Biden has had a steep cognitive and I also think physical decline. He raises a troubling possibility that the president's team may have simply avoided doing the kind of cognitive tests that could have led to a formal diagnosis, as he puts it. If there's no diagnosis, there's nothing to disclose. So, how does the country prevent this from happening again? One potential solution offered is a new law that would legally require the president's physician to certify to Congress that the commander-in-chief is, in fact, physically and cognitively fit to serve. Without a law like that, we're left relying on a president's willingness to be transparent